Hello, my name is Camila Montenegro, and this is a video project for Unit 3, Lesson 12 of We the People. The Philadelphia Convention was a convention that was called by Congress. The delegates, who were also known as framers, wanted to fix the Articles of Confederation. But soon enough, they realized that the problems were too severe, so they all agreed on writing a new constitution. Who were the people that attended the Philadelphia Convention? Well, 55 of the delegates attended the meeting, all which were men. Most of them were young, even though the average age was about 42. James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Gouverneur Morris attended the meeting. Benjamin Franklin was by far the oldest by being 81 years old. Who did not attend the Philadelphia Convention? Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Patrick Henry were amongst the people that did not go. There were no women, African Americans, or American Indians allowed to go. John Adams was in England, while Thomas Jefferson was in France. They were both there for the same reason, to represent the United States. Patrick Henry, however, refused to go because he was against the idea of a strong national government. Rhode Island refused to send delegates because citizens were too independent and were becoming hostile of a new constitution. The Articles of Confederation. What were they? The Articles of Confederation was the first document before the U.S. Constitution. The Articles were missing a strong national government, which in the end was needed to protect fundamental rights. So instead of going for the idea that they could just fix it, they decided to do a whole nother document, which was the U.S. Constitution. The Articles were missing separation of powers, which was needed to prevent the abuse of the branch's powers. A republic form of government was needed to make sure that the government served the common good. Because the basic ideas were all agreed upon, they decided to scrap it so they could make the U.S. Constitution. So today, now we have the U.S. Constitution. What were framers? Framers were also known as delegates because they framed the whole U.S. Constitution. All the framers agreed that George Washington should attend all the meetings. In the beginning of the meeting, they decided that they should scratch the idea of fixing the Articles of Confederation, and they just ended up deciding to make a new one. A lot of them were frightened that if word got out of their conversations in the meetings, that they wouldn't be able to express all their opinions so freely. So the United States Constitution. What is it? Well, the United States Constitution is a document that helps provide order in the country. So delegates thought it would be easier if they were to write a new document instead of having to try and fix the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were lacking in many areas, like they did not have a central government, nor did they produce money. They agreed it would be better if they kept the conversation from the public so it would be easier for their opinions, and it would be easier to pass the Constitution. They also thought giving each state a vote, no matter in the size, would help the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is there to help the common good, to prevent anything from happening to the country, but it does have its flaws.
May 1787, Philadelphia. It's now or never for the anything but United States of America. If they don't come up with a constitution to establish a functioning central government, the new nation will most certainly implode. The states send 55 delegates to a constitutional convention to repair the woefully inadequate Articles of Confederation.
There are all kinds of questions about what's going to be the direction for this new nation. And you can't have 13 different answers. You need to have one answer.
These men are charged with nothing less than devising a whole new system of government. The one thing they can agree on is to keep the proceedings secret to ensure candor and allow a full range of argument. Among the group are both new and old faces, including the most revered man in America.
Washington is the presiding chairman, president of the Constitutional Convention. His presence is very important for the legitimacy of this new Constitution.
The last thing George Washington wanted to do after 8 grueling years of war was leave his beloved Mount Vernon home. At 55, he is tempted to rest on his laurels, but he is keenly aware that all his efforts could be undone if government doesn't change.
I think Washington is nervous about what's going to happen to the country if they don't have a new form of government. He has a national vision of America. That's why he's important to be in that room.
There are other visions in the room, Alexander Hamilton from New York is a brilliant 32-year-old war veteran and attorney. Benjamin Franklin, the great negotiator, now old, frail, but ever wise and reliable, joins the Pennsylvania delegation. Among the missing are two of the Revolution's most forceful voices, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who are serving as foreign ministers in England and France.
Adams and Jefferson just, I think, are frantic with the fact that a new government's being written about and they're not there.
In their place, the man with the plan, the Virginia Plan, is James Madison, a 36-year-old career politician from Virginia. Madison knew this moment would come and has spent years formulating a new governing structure.
That I am not John Green. The first American government, which was in place during the Revolutionary War and for almost 10 years afterwards, was the Articles of Confederation. Like many first attempts, the Articles government had some good ideas and it meant well, but it was poorly executed. Just give it a break. It never did this before. So when delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles, they ended up scrapping the whole thing and creating a new constitution. It's probably not because they didn't know what revise meant. So the delegates from the various states each had their own agendas at the Constitutional Convention, and that made it difficult for them to agree on what the new government should look like. In order to hammer out a constitution, they had to do something you don't see very much in government these days. Compromise. Oh, let's compromise. I'm sorry. These days. Compromise. Oh, let's compromise. I'm sorry, Eagle, I didn't mean. Before we get into what those compromises were, it's kind of necessary to look at what was so bad about the Articles government in the first place. The main thing was it really couldn't govern. There was no executive branch or president and no judiciary to settle disputes. It was basically just a Congress where each state was equally represented and they all pretty much had veto power and could sink legislation they didn't like. All decisions were collective, which meant that very few decisions were actually made, because it's really hard to get 13 people to agree on something that will be in the interest of all 13. I can barely agree with Stan on anything, right, Stan? He said wrong. Most important, the Articles government had no power to levy taxes, which meant that if it needed any money to do, well, anything, it had to ask for the money from the states, which were free to say, no, I don't think we'll be giving you any money today, or tomorrow, or ever. As I remember from my college years, and I don't remember much, living without money is awful. Without money, it's pretty much impossible for a government to do anything, except buy ramen noodles. The Articles government was able to accomplish one notable thing, though. One of the big issues it had to deal with was Americans moving out west, which in the 1770s and 80s meant to places like Ohio and Indiana that weren't states yet. The government managed to set up rules for these settlements in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This set up a system for eventual statehood, but most importantly, it forbade slavery in these territories, which, as students of American history know, was kind of a big deal. You wouldn't know that. You're not a student. Other than that, though, the Articles government was a flop. And the very thing that made it so ineffective threatened to screw up any attempts at new government, too. This was the issue of competing interests between different states. More specifically, the states with large populations and the smaller states. Basically, a state with a large population, like, say, Virginia, had different needs than a state with a small population, like Delaware. More importantly, large states might stand to benefit more from any government spending. When the delegates decided to make a new Congress, these large population states wanted the number of representatives to that Congress to be proportional to the states' populations, which would mean that the larger states would have more representatives than the smaller ones. This idea, a large Congress made up of many delegates, was called the Virginia Plan because it was put forward by the delegates from Wisconsin. Just kidding, Virginia. The delegates from small New Jersey put forward a plan that would have a Congress where each state would send an equal number of representatives. In other words, something that looked a lot like the Articles government. This New Jersey plan would prevent smaller states from being dominated by the larger states, and also ensure that the large states wouldn't be able to vote themselves a bigger share of government spending. These two opposing interests threatened to scuttle the whole new government thing until Roger Sherman from Connecticut proposed the Great Compromise that gave us the bicameral legislature that we talked about in episode 2, and we've all come to know and love. Sometimes. So the Great Compromise meant that we would have a two-house legislature, but this wasn't the only issue related to how the seats in Congress would be apportioned. The membership in the House would be based on the state's population, but at the time there was an issue about how to count that population. The issue was slavery, more specifically, how to count slaves as part of the state's population. Let's go to the thought bubble. The states with large slave populations like South Carolina and Virginia had a pretty big interest in counting these slaves for the purposes of determining representation. And the states with few slaves didn't want them counted at all, because this would mean that the white non-slave people in those states with lots of slaves would effectively be better represented than the white non-slave people in the states with few slaves. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention solved this problem with another compromise that was decidedly less great. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution includes the following clause. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. If you're looking for the word slave, you won't find it. They're the ones described by the phrase 3/5 of all other persons. This is the notorious 3/5 compromise. What it means is that in order to determine how many representatives a state has, you count the number of free people in the state, including indentured servants, and add to that number 3/5 of the number of non-free persons, otherwise known as slaves. So in terms of counting, each slave was worth 3/5 of each free person. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Anyway, this meant that the states with large populations of slaves would be disproportionately represented in Congress, but not quite so badly that most northern states with small numbers of slaves wouldn't vote for the Constitution. What this also did was enshrine the idea that slaves, who were mostly black, were worth less than free people, who were mostly white, and it embedded slavery into the Constitution. So before this Constitution of Compromise could go into effect, it had to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states. So each state had a special convention where delegates could vote on whether or not to adopt the new Constitution. These conventions were more open to the public than the Constitutional Convention itself, and the ratification process is the reason why some people say the Constitution is based on the will of the people.